haven't heard, Next Auth came out with a new version 5 and there's not much documentation around it. That's probably because Next Auth is becoming part of Auth.js, so if you go to their original website, it will redirect you to the pages on Auth.js, which doesn't contain full information. That's why it took me way longer than I expected I would spend on authentication on one of my projects, even though I've used their previous version, so I know how it works. So I figured I would make this video, save you time and hassle, so you can set up your auth in just minutes. Besides the setup, we'll cover API routes, session information, and functions and how to use them on both server and client components. So let's get started. Navigate to your Next.js project, or if you don't have one created, with this create next app command. And for reference, I'm using version 14 of Next.js for this project. And we'll use this npm command to install the Next Auth module. After it's installed, we'll navigate to source folder and create a file named auth.ts. If you don't have a source folder and just have an app one, then you can create the file in the root of your project. Also, if you're not using TypeScript, then your file could be .js instead. So inside the file, we export Next Auth function and we add the configuration for a provider, which dictates how users can log in, whether it's an email or using social accounts. Using this case, I'm configuring Google Provider, so I'll update the import instead to Google. And next up, I'll update the providers array for the Next Auth function. Google Provider does take in an object as an argument that has two fields, client ID and client secret. The values for these fields should be stored as an environment variables, as it is sensitive information, so let's pass that. And to the exports, let's also add sign in and sign out functions. More on this later. So the project that you see here on which I'm adding authentication is the one that I'm building for my full stack tutorial, where we'll build an app that using AI creates a full form for you after just giving it a prompt. But any code related to the Next Auth, now we'll write from scratch, so creating new files, new configurations, so you would be able to follow along and apply it to your own project. By the way, here's a quick sneak peek of the project that I mentioned that I'm working on. I'll upload it after it's done on YouTube. In case you're watching this video after the tutorial is finished, the link will be in the description. Otherwise, if you want to be notified when it's ready, you can turn on the notifications on uploads on my channel, or click the link that will send you in the description. We'll send you an email when the video's up. Now back to the tutorial, we need to add environment variables that would go inside your .env file. If you don't have one, you can create at the root of the project and paste the definitions using variable names we used in this auth file. So we're going to need only two values, Google Client ID and Google Client Secret, and make sure the spelling has to match the one in auth.ts. And as I mentioned, there are other providers. I'm trying to show you guys the list of all the providers or like login methods that you can provide using Next Auth. But the website seems to be the search overlay not working. Okay, let me just select from the menu. So these are all the other ways that your users can log in. And if you click a single one of them, it will show you the import method that you can use at the top, and also a field that you have to add inside providers array. So you can configure using this method any provider, and afterwards once you configure them, all the other code for authentication, like functions we'll use for sign in, sign out, will be the same. So if I want to add another, for example, Apple provider, I'm just going to add an import at the top, and in the providers array, I'll add a value like I'm doing now in this case. And this was just for reference, so I'm going to clear that out. So we have defined environment variables in our .env file. Now let's get the values for them, and I'm navigated for console.cloud.google, where I'll create those credentials. So click on new project and give it a name. Then we're going to click create. And once it's first loading, so make sure you have that new project selected just in case you have other project, and we have to wait until it finishes creating. So now it's done. I'm going to select it. I'm going to navigate from the left menu, left sidebar, to credentials, and here create credentials. We'll select auth client ID, and then sometimes it asks us to configure a consent screen. If it needs you to, then this pop-up will appear. Click on that, and for user type, let's select external, which means it's available. Anyone with Google account can log in. And here it will ask you information like the name and the email of developer, and it'll show up on the right side when there's a login page for Google, you know, when you ask it for permission and which account to log in. So I'm gonna fill that out, save, and then on the second script for scope, I'm not gonna change anything, save and continue. So once we have this auth consent screen, we can click back to the dashboard, and on the dashboard, we can select the credentials one more time, create credentials, auth client ID. Here we select application type, which is web application, and you can modify the name if you want. And this is the important part, so make sure you don't miss it, that in authorized redirect URLs, you have to pass in the localhost and then the /API callback Google. And I think I have an extra space. Let me remove that and create. And this URL would be different once you deploy it. So let's copy the client and the secret ID that it gives us on the screen. Now I'm ready to go back to the project, and I'll paste these values inside that env file. And one more variable that we need is this auth secret, and even in the old documentations, this was not part of the setup documentation. For some reason, they only added, and if you set it up Next Auth without the secret, it actually throws an error. So it is in errors, like debugging part, where you generate it, add the variable to your environment variables. In the old version, we had to also configure it to pass it to the Next Auth. Right now, the module would, if you have it in environment variables and if you name it auth secret, the module would automatically read from your file. There's two ways of generating. You can do it online, or you can copy this command right in your terminal, which is what I'm going to do, and it will return a value for me, which I'm going to copy and then take it to my environment variables, create a new secret with the name auth secret, and paste that in. Alright, now we need to create an API route which our functions would later use to call that API, and that would be inside app folder. We should name it API for any API routes. That's the Next.js way. And here I'll create a new folder for auth and another folder which is Next Auth in array. This is how Next Auth module, the route that also would read, so you should follow this like very same names. And to create the API route, we use route.either JS or TS based on which language you're using. And in here, I'm gonna port the methods get and post from the auth file that we have created. And here we indicate the path to that file. For me, add auth works because I have configured import aliases for every basically folder or file in app folder would be accessible by if you put at and the name of the folder or file. But if that doesn't work for you, you can instead just the traditional way of indicating path by going that many folders back and the file name like this. And even if the path is correct, it is still showing errors because the variable names are incorrect. I don't have get and post exported from auth, it's just a handler. So we can go back to the auth file, and in handlers we can do a destructuring to just extract get and post specifically. Now if we save that, go back to our route file and update the import path, then now it should be working. So that would be it for our API route. And to test that very API route, we can navigate to the browser, and after the localhost URL, we can type API route auth and sign in. That should redirect us to sign in page. With Google, we click on that, select your account that you want to sign in with, and it should redirect back to the index page. Okay, now that we have API route, let's put our authentication functions and information into our component. So in my components folder, I'll create a new file for header and create a functional component. There's two types of component, server and client, and we'll go over how to use Next Auth in both of them. First one, this is server component. So we import auth, sign in, and sign out functions. For server components, this directly comes from the auth file that we created. I'm also going to import a button. I'm using ShadCN UI library, but if you don't have that, you can just use the default button that's built in Next.js. And after the button, let's do also import image because I want to display the Google profile photo in the header of the user. So that would be image from next image, and we also need a link for when we will create a button for signing. Okay, since we have that, first thing, let's access the session information, create new constant session, and it would be await and this auth function. But since we have await, we have to make this function async. So let's do that at the top, and we can take a peek at the session by console logging it. So let's do. Now we're ready to update what we have inside the header return statement. So I'm gonna update this div, turn it into a header, and inside header I'll add a nav tag where first we're gonna have the name of the application or your logo on the left side and then buttons on the right side. So creating a new div, I'll just put the text inside h1 as a logo, and then I'll create another div, and here this div would be conditional and we would need to access session information because we're displaying different things if user is logged in, right? So we do session user, that means that user exists. In that case, we create the div, and if the user is not logged in, then we display a link to the login page, so API auth sign in. And we close this link tag, and inside here let's add a button that says sign in. So, and then if user is already signed in, let's just display their name, so session.username. Once we save that, let's import into our main page in page.tsx. So I'm going to import the header, and I think it's not it's an export default, so let's update that. And above the main section, I'm gonna add header and wrap this whole thing in a fragment. If we go back to our application, we're going to see the text that we added and sign in button as not signed into the application. Now let's go back to our header file and add a sign out button. For that, we need to create a separate component, and I'm going to do that inside the same file since it's a pretty small component. So function sign out, and it will return a form with a button, and inside the form we're going to pass in an action. I'll define action right here as well, since it would be a server action, so it's async component, and the server actions we mark them as use server keyword, and after call await and sign out from the next auth. So once I have that inside the form, I'm adding a button, and type would be submit, so when it's clicked, this form action would be triggered and sign out would happen. So now I'm going to remove inside the div, instead of showing the name, I'm just going to show sign out button. So let's save that and add some styling for the header. It would be some border that will only show up at the bottom, and for the nav, let's do class name background white. Also update the border color, add some paddings on X and Y axis. Okay, that looks better. And I'm going to make the div inside flex, flex wrap, and justify between with centering items and margin, setting it to auto so the items display spread apart, like that. Okay. Let's also update the variant of the sign-in, make it link, so that will change the styling. Next up, I want to display the profile image of the Google account that user has, but since the URL of the image, we do have that as a part of session information, but to display image from another website, we need to configure in Next.js. So going to next.config.js, follow the updates as images, then remote patterns. So for protocol HTTPS, then for hostname, we're gonna pass the hostname that Google uses, like the URL of it. Port would be string, so the path name would be this A and stars. And then this I followed after examining the image URL. So once we have that configured, now we can create an image and pass that user image as a source. So I'll make it right next to the sign out button, image source equals to session user.image. We have to also add the alt text, which would be just the user.name. Width and height are required. I'm going to do 32 for both of them, and for class name I'll do rounded full. As I'm using Tailwind, it would make this turn into a circle. And let's also check that username and user image is available. In that case, we'll display the image and the sign out. I accidentally removed it, so let me put it back. Okay, I'm gonna sign in right now with Google, and now that I'm signing, I see both of them. Let me also update the class name, make this div flags and item center so they show up side by side. Okay, so that's what we have for our image and sign out, as well as for the sign in buttons. And if we want to examine what other fields are part of session, we did this console log, so you can check that in the terminal. So we're doing it in terminal, not in the browser, since this is a server component, so console would show up here for that one. And you can see the pattern of the image URL that we defined in our Next config. Otherwise, if we just try to call the image in the new version of Next, it would throw an error. Okay, let's remove the console log and now move on to a client component. So inside my app folder, I have another folder and index.tsx file contains the client components. How do you know that it's client? It has used client keyword at the top. And here, if I wanted to get session information, I'm going to import the use session hook instead from Next Auth React. Also, I'm going to do sign in function, and so it will be Next Auth /React, which comes once we install the Next Auth library. And inside my component here, at the start of the definition of component, I'm going to create a new session variable, and I will call this use session hook. So when there's changes made to the session, this hook gets updated, and we can examine also the information about the session. I'm going to do another console log session. This time it should show up in the browser. But before we test that, if we want to use session hook, we need to make sure that component is wrapped inside, it lives inside provider. So for example, here I'm going to go back to the page, and we have a header, that server component we created, and form generator is the client component. So what I'm going to do is I can wrap my whole application inside this Next Auth provider, or I can only pick the client components that I need to access this use session hook. So let me import this session provider at the top, and it's also coming from Next Auth React. So let's add that session provider outside of the component, save that, and now if I go back to my client component and save the changes, in here in the browser, let's examine our console, and we can expand on the object, which is session object, and we have this information coming in from console log. And I also imported at the top sign-in function. Let's say I want to restrict some functionalities to only signed in users, and I want to check that. We can do that using if statement, and we either check if user data that session data that user exists, or if the status equals to authenticated. So if that is true, then I'm going to continue with the functionality, open a model, but if not, then we can redirect them to the sign-in page. So I'm going to move this code over here, and in else statement here, I'm going to do sign out, and yeah, it's sign in. And yeah, we imported that from Next Auth React module, and let's test it out. I'm gonna go back to the application and I'm gonna sign out first, so that when I try to do this on sign in, it will redirect me to the sign in page. That'll be it for authentication. Thank you for watching yet another tutorial, and if you're new here, welcome. Make sure to follow along. I'll be making more full stack tutorials, and just wanted to share I started learning Procreate Dreams, so I made this animation. Hope you like it, and I'll see you in the next one.